The sun was barely peeking through the autumn leaves when Mrs. Anderson started her usual morning routine. She hummed softly while making breakfast, the smell of pancakes floating through their modest two-bedroom apartment. As a single mother and elementary school teacher, she had mastered the art of multitasking, packing lunch with one hand while checking her daughter's homework with the other. Her daughter, Amy, sat at their small kitchen table, legs swinging back and forth as she carefully colored the poster for her science presentation. The topic was our solar system, and she had spent the entire weekend working on it, determined to make it perfect. Her round glasses kept sliding down her nose as she concentrated, tongue sticking out slightly, a habit she'd had since she was tiny. "Mom, do you think I'll remember everything?" Amy asked, looking up from her work. The mix of excitement and nervousness in her voice made Mrs. Anderson smile. She remembered feeling the same way at Amy's age, that butterfly in stomach feeling before presenting in front of the class. "Of course you will, sweetheart. You've practiced so hard," Mrs. Anderson assured her, placing a plate of star-shaped pancakes in front of her daughter. It was their special tradition for important days, making breakfast in shapes that matched whatever was special about that day. The simple gesture always made Amy beam with joy. Their morning routine continued like a well-rehearsed dance. Mrs. Anderson packed Amy's favorite lunch, a peanut butter and banana sandwich cut into triangles, carrot sticks arranged in a little star pattern, keeping with the space theme, and a small note of encouragement tucked beside the juice box. These little touches were her way of staying connected with Amy throughout the school day. As they gathered their things, Mrs. Anderson checked the time. 7:30 a.m. Perfect timing, as always. She helped Amy carefully roll up her poster, making sure not to crease the edges. The girl clutched her project proudly as they headed down the 3 flights of stairs to their car, the familiar creak of the 3rd step from the bottom making them both giggle. It was one of those tiny details of home that had become a shared joke between them. Their silver car sat in its usual spot, slightly dusty from the fall pollen, but reliable as ever. Mrs. Anderson had bought it used 3 years ago, and while it wasn't fancy, it was their faithful companion for countless school runs, grocery trips, and weekend adventures. Amy climbed into the back seat, carefully positioning her poster where it wouldn't get bent. As they pulled out of their parking spot, Amy started sharing random space facts she'd learned while researching her project. "Mom, did you know that 1 day on Venus is longer than 1 year on Venus?" she announced proudly from the back seat. Mrs. Anderson listened intently, adding appropriate wows and reallys at just the right moments. The morning traffic was light, and the autumn air coming through the slightly opened windows was crisp and invigorating. Red and golden leaves danced across the street as they drove, and Amy counted the dogs they passed being walked by their owners. Another one of their morning rituals. The radio played softly in the background, mixing with Amy's excited chatter about her upcoming presentation. Looking in the rearview mirror, Mrs. Anderson caught sight of her daughter practicing her presentation gestures, her small hands moving animatedly as she whispered to herself. The scene warmed her heart. These precious morning moments were what she lived for. She'd been teaching 3rd grade for 8 years, but watching her own daughter grow and learn brought a completely different kind of joy. Little did they know that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but routine. The clock on the dashboard read 7:45 a.m. when the red and blue lights started flashing in Mrs. Anderson's rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. She was certain she'd been following all traffic rules. She glanced back at Amy, who had stopped mid-sentence in her space facts recitation, her eyes wide with curiosity. "It's okay, sweetheart," Mrs. Anderson said calmly, though her hands gripped the steering wheel a bit tighter. Following protocol exactly as she'd always taught Amy to do, she turned on her hazard lights, slowly pulled to the right side of the quiet residential street, and brought the car to a complete stop. She remembered her father's words from years ago. Always keep your hands visible on the steering wheel. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, A neighbor's dog was barking. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer Barrett approach. Something about his walk made her stomach tighten. His steps were too quick, too aggressive for a routine traffic stop. She could hear his heavy boots on the pavement, each step seeming louder than the last. The morning had turned unusually quiet, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. License and registration, came the sharp command before he had even fully reached her window. His tone made Amy stop fidgeting with her poster in the backseat. Mrs. Anderson noticed his hand was already resting on his weapon, a detail that sent a chill down her spine despite the warm morning. "Of course, officer," she replied, keeping her voice steady and polite. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" She maintained eye contact through the mirror, noticing how he stood slightly behind her window, making it difficult for her to see him clearly. The morning sun caught his badge, number 247, sending a bright reflection across her dashboard. "You ran that stop sign back there," he snapped, though Mrs. Anderson distinctly remembered making a full stop. She had even reminded Amy at that very moment about how the solar system poster would fall if they stopped too quickly. She could feel her daughter's eyes on her through the rearview mirror, watching, learning how to handle difficult situations. "Sir, I'm certain I made a complete stop," she said respectfully but firmly. "I always do, especially with my daughter in the car." She gestured slightly toward Amy, who was hugging her poster like a shield. The officer's eyes darted to the backseat, but his expression didn't soften. Mrs. Anderson slowly reached for her phone, which was sitting in the cup holder. "I'd like to document this interaction, if you don't mind," she said clearly, remembering her rights. This simple action seemed to flip a switch in Officer Barrett's demeanor. His face hardened, and his stance shifted. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, though her hands had never left the steering wheel except to reach for the phone she just mentioned. The change in his voice made Amy whimper slightly in the backseat. Through the rearview mirror, Mrs. Anderson could see her daughter's lower lip trembling. Mrs. Anderson's mind raced, but she kept her exterior calm. She noticed a couple walking their dog had stopped to watch the interaction. The woman had her phone out, and somehow this small detail gave Mrs. Anderson a sense of security. Other eyes were watching. She wasn't alone. "Officer," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm a teacher at Pine Grove Elementary. We're on our way to school, and my daughter has a presentation today. I'm happy to cooperate, but I would like to understand why you seem so agitated when I've been nothing but respectful." The morning breeze carried the scent of someone's freshly brewed coffee from a nearby house, such a normal, peaceful smell in contrast to the tension building around their car. A school bus passed on the cross street, a reminder that this was supposed to be just another Tuesday morning. Mrs. Anderson could feel her heart pounding, but she kept her breathing steady, knowing Amy was watching how her mother handled this situation. What happened next would change their lives forever. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. Mrs. Anderson could hear the gentle rustling of her daughter's science poster in the backseat, tiny hands gripping paper too tightly from nervousness. A morning breeze carried the sound of children laughing at a nearby bus stop, a harsh contrast to the heavy silence around their car. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Barrett demanded, his voice rising. The sudden command made Mrs. Anderson's heart race, but she kept her composure. Her first thought was of her daughter, who was watching everything with wide eyes through the rearview mirror. She had always taught Amy that police officers were there to help, but this situation was quickly proving different. "Officer, I'd prefer to stay in my car with my daughter," she replied calmly, her hands still visible on the steering wheel. "Could you please explain why that's necessary?" The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the street. More neighbors had started to appear on their porches, coffee cups in hand, their morning routines interrupted by the scene unfolding. Officer Barrett's radio crackled with distant voices, but he ignored it. Instead, he moved closer to the car window, his badge catching the sunlight. "I won't ask again," he said, his tone carrying an edge that made the hair on the back of Mrs. Anderson's neck stand up. She could smell his coffee breath mixed with mint gum. Such an ordinary detail in such an extraordinary moment. From the back seat came a small voice. "Mom." The tremor in Amy's voice broke Mrs. Anderson's heart. She could see her daughter's reflection in the mirror, the carefully made space poster now crumpled in her nervous grip. The planets they had so carefully colored together were getting crushed, just like the morning they had planned. Mrs. Anderson made a decision. Keeping her movements slow and deliberate, she reached for her phone again. "Officer, I have the right to record this interaction," she stated firmly but respectfully. "I'm going to pick up my phone now, and then I'll step out of the car." She remembered the community workshop she'd attended last summer about knowing your rights. Knowledge that felt crucial now. The growing crowd of onlookers had their own phones out. Mrs. Anderson could see Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down, still in her morning robe, phone raised high. The retired teacher from across the street stood on his porch, phone also recording. Somehow, their presence felt like a protective circle around the car. "You're being difficult," Officer Barrett snapped, his hand now fully resting on his weapon. The morning light caught his nameplate, and Mrs. Anderson made sure to remember every detail. She could hear more sirens in the distance, though she wasn't sure if they were headed their way or just part of the regular morning traffic. Amy's voice came again from the backseat, stronger this time. "We were just going to school. I have to present about Neptune." The simple, innocent statement hung in the air, a reminder of how quickly an ordinary morning had turned into something else entirely. Mrs. Anderson spoke clearly, making sure her words were caught by the numerous recording phones around them. "Officer, I'm cooperating fully, but I will not exit my vehicle without documentation of this interaction. My 8-year-old daughter is in the car, and I need to ensure everyone's safety." The morning had grown unusually quiet. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. A school bus passed slowly on the cross street, children's faces pressed against windows, watching. Mrs. Anderson caught sight of one of her students on the bus, his mouth open in surprise at seeing his teacher in this situation. Officer Barrett's next move would send shockwaves through their small community. His hand moved from his weapon, but the look in his eyes told Mrs. Anderson this was far from over. She silently prayed that all those phones were still recording, that someone had called for help, that her daughter would be okay. The sound of approaching footsteps from behind their car signaled that things were about to change dramatically. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Barrett suddenly yanked open the driver's door. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of fresh-cut grass from a neighbor's yard. Mrs. Anderson's hands remained steady on the wheel, her mother's instincts screaming to stay calm for her daughter's sake. "I said, get out." The officer's voice boomed through the quiet street. Mrs. Anderson could hear Amy's quiet sobs from the back seat, the sound mixing with the gentle rustle of her now crumpled science poster. The planets they'd spent hours coloring together were becoming tear-stained, Saturn's rings blurring into its surface. Mrs. Anderson spoke clearly, knowing the neighbors' phones were still recording. "I'll step out, but please understand you're frightening my child." She began to move slowly, deliberately, just as she'd learned in that community safety workshop last summer. Her teacher's ID badge caught the morning light as it swung from her neck, a reminder of the ordinary day this was supposed to be. Without warning, Officer Barrett grabbed her arm. The world spun for a moment as he pulled her from the car, her sensible teaching shoes scraping against the pavement. The coffee she'd carefully packed in her travel mug spilled across the car seat, forming a brown stain that looked oddly like the Mars landscape Amy had drawn on her poster. "Mom." Amy's scream pierced the morning air. Mrs. Anderson could hear the clicking sounds of phones recording, the gasps from neighbors, someone shouting, "This isn't right," from their porch. But all she could focus on was staying upright, staying conscious of every movement. Then it happened. The officer's hand struck her face, a sharp, sudden movement that seemed to echo through the quiet street. The morning sun briefly blinded her, or maybe it was the shock. She tasted the mint toothpaste from her morning routine, now mixed with something metallic. But Mrs. Anderson didn't fall. Years of handling rowdy third graders had given her an unexpected balance. She stood her ground, feet planted firmly on the sun-warmed pavement. Her cheek stung, but her voice remained steady as she spoke. I want to be very clear that you just struck me without provocation. All these people are witnessing this. The retired teacher from across the street, still in his morning robe, called out, "We're all recording this, officer." His voice trembled with a mixture of anger and concern. More neighbors had gathered, their presence forming a protective circle around the scene. Someone was on the phone with 911, their voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Through the car window, Mrs. Anderson could see Amy's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, fogging up her little glasses. The sight broke her heart, but strengthened her resolve. She thought of all the times she taught her students about standing up for what's right, about being brave in the face of wrongdoing. Now she was living those lessons. "My daughter is watching," Mrs. Anderson said firmly, her voice carrying across the now silent street. "She's watching you abuse your power, and she's watching me stand up to it." Her words seemed to hang in the morning air, heavy with truth and purpose. The officer's radio crackled to life. Backup was arriving, but it wasn't just police sirens they could hear approaching. News vans were pulling up at the end of the street, their satellite dishes visible over the tops of blooming cherry trees. Mrs. Chen, still recording everything, had apparently called every news station in town. The morning had transformed their quiet street into something else entirely. Children waiting for their school buses stood wide-eyed on corners, parents hugging them close. The crossing guard from the nearby elementary school had abandoned her post to rush over, her bright orange vest a splash of color in the tense scene. Mrs. Anderson straightened her shoulders, ignoring the throbbing in her cheek. She could feel the eyes of every neighbor, every child, and most importantly, her daughter, watching how she handled this moment. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every parent who'd ever feared for their child's safety, every person who'd ever faced injustice and had to decide whether to stand or fall. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, promising that this morning was far from over. The next few minutes unfolded like scenes from a movie, but this was painfully real. 2 police cars arrived with sirens wailing, their lights painting the morning in flashing red and blue. The sound made Amy cover her ears in the backseat, her science poster forgotten on the floor. Through it all, Mrs. Anderson remained standing, one hand gently touching her swollen cheek. The first backup officer, a woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, took in the scene quickly. She noticed the crowd of neighbors with their phones raised, the trembling child in the car, and Mrs. Anderson's quiet dignity. Most importantly, she saw Officer Barrett's aggressive stance and immediately stepped between them. "I've got this now," the female officer said firmly to Barrett, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned to Mrs. Anderson, speaking softly but clearly. "Are you all right, ma'am? Medical assistance is on the way." The morning air had grown warmer, but Mrs. Anderson couldn't stop shivering. Neighbors were giving their statements to the second officer. Mrs. Chen, still in her flower print robe, was showing her phone footage, gesturing animatedly. "I saw everything. She did nothing wrong." The retired teacher had his tablet out, having recorded the entire incident in high definition. Even the teenage boy, who usually slept until noon, was on his front steps, describing what he'd witnessed from his bedroom window. A news van pulled up, then another. Reporters with microphones and camera crews spilled onto the sidewalk like ants from a disturbed hill. Mrs. Anderson thought about how she planned to talk about ants with her third-grade class today. They were studying insect communities. Instead, she was watching her own community rally around her in an unexpected display of unity. Amy's small voice called from the car, "Can I get out now?" The question broke Mrs. Anderson's heart all over again. Her daughter had just witnessed something no child should see, yet here she was, still thinking about following rules and asking permission. The female officer nodded kindly, and Mrs. Anderson opened the back door. Amy flew into her arms, glasses askew, poster crackling between them. "Mom, your face," she whispered, touching her mother's cheek gently. Mrs. Anderson hugged her daughter tighter, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood. An ambulance arrived, its siren mercifully quiet. The paramedics, a young man with friendly freckles and an older woman with braided hair, insisted on checking Mrs. Anderson's injury. As they worked, Amy held her mother's hand, refusing to let go. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the pavement where her spilled coffee was slowly drying. Neighbors kept appearing, drawn by the commotion and staying out of concern. Someone brought over bottles of water. Another neighbor offered Amy a chocolate bar, remembering how sugar could help with shock. The crossing guard had called the school, explaining why one of their teachers and a student would be late. Mrs. Anderson watched as Officer Barrett was led aside by his superior, who had just arrived. Their conversation seemed intense, with Barrett's face growing redder by the minute. The police chief's car pulled up, its arrival marking how serious the situation had become. Through it all, phones kept recording. Some neighbors were already posting on social media, their angry comments and supportive messages spreading across the internet like wildfire. Mrs. Anderson could hear snippets of their conversations. In front of her child. "She was so brave. This has to stop." A small group of her students' parents had arrived, having recognized her car on their morning commute. They stood together, a protective cluster of familiar faces. One mom was on the phone with the school board. Another was already calling the local civil rights office. Their presence reminded Mrs. Anderson of how communities could come together in crisis. Amy tugged at her sleeve, pointing to her crushed poster. "Mom, Neptune got ripped," she said softly. Such a small detail in the grand scheme of things, yet it perfectly captured the innocence shattered that morning. Mrs. Anderson smoothed the wrinkled paper as best she could, just as she would need to help smooth over her daughter's trust in authority figures after this. The morning was growing warmer, but the real heat was just beginning to build. By mid-afternoon, the video had spread like wildfire across social media. People were sharing it with angry face emojis and calls for justice, their comments flooding local news websites. The quiet neighborhood street had transformed into something between a media circus and a community gathering, with news vans parked alongside concerned citizens bringing food and support. Mrs. Anderson sat on her front porch, holding an ice pack to her cheek while Amy napped inside, exhausted from the morning's events. The school principal had personally driven over to excuse both of them for the day. She'd brought Amy's favorite stuffed astronaut toy from her classroom, understanding how a child might need comfort after such trauma. Neighbors kept arriving with casseroles and cookies, like a steady stream of love wrapped in aluminum foil and Tupperware. Mrs. Chen had organized a roster for people to take turns keeping watch outside the house. No more unexpected visitors, she declared firmly, her usual quiet demeanor replaced by protective determination. The local NAACP chapter president arrived around 2 p.m., accompanied by 2 civil rights attorneys. They sat with Mrs. Anderson on the porch, their presence drawing even more news cameras. But it was the steady flow of her students' parents that truly touched her heart. They came with handmade signs and gentle hugs, their children making cards decorated with wobbly hearts and misspelled words of encouragement. "My daughter couldn't stop crying when she heard," one mom said, setting down a container of homemade soup. "She said you're the best teacher she's ever had, and she doesn't understand why anyone would hurt you." The words brought fresh tears to Mrs. Anderson's eyes, but they were different tears now, touched by the pure love of her students. The retired teacher from across the street had turned his front yard into an impromptu command center. His printer worked overtime, producing flyers announcing a community meeting. His wife kept a pot of coffee going for the steady stream of supporters and journalists. Their normally pristine lawn was trampled, but they didn't seem to mind. Online support grew by the minute. A parent had started a fundraiser for legal fees, and it was already approaching 6 figures. Comments poured in from across the country. Standing with you. This stops now. Teachers deserve better. Local businesses changed their signs to messages of support. The pizza place where Amy loved to celebrate good grades announced they were donating a day's profits to the cause. As evening approached, someone started setting up folding chairs on the community lawn. A candlelight vigil was forming without any formal organization. People just showed up, candles in hand, quiet determination on their faces. The setting sun painted the scene in soft oranges and pinks, the growing circle of lights reflecting off tear-streaked faces. Amy woke up and came outside, clutching her astronaut toy. She looked at the crowd with wide eyes, then at her mother. "Are all these people here because of us?" she asked softly. Mrs. Anderson pulled her daughter close, wondering how to explain that sometimes bad things lead to beautiful displays of human kindness. The local news crews caught the moment when Amy's entire class showed up, led by their substitute teacher. Each child carried a piece of poster board with a planet drawn on it. They'd spent their science period recreating Amy's presentation poster. The gesture was so pure, so thoughtful, it made even the hardened news reporters wipe their eyes. As darkness fell, the candlelight vigil grew. People sang softly, shared stories, and made promises to do better as a community. Mrs. Anderson watched as Amy walked among the crowd, accepting gentle hugs and words of encouragement. Her daughter's fear from the morning was slowly being replaced by understanding. Understanding that for every person who might hurt you, there are hundreds more ready to stand beside you. The police chief arrived, not with sirens but quietly, respectfully. He requested to speak with Mrs. Anderson privately, his face grave with the weight of necessary change. The community watched, their candles flickering in the evening breeze, as tomorrow's headlines were being shaped by tonight's actions. The law office buzzed with quiet intensity as Mrs. Anderson sat across from 2 civil rights attorneys. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting shadows across the stack of papers, videos, and witness statements spread across the polished wooden table. Her cheek had healed, but the memory remained fresh. "We have statements from 27 witnesses," the lead attorney said, adjusting her reading glasses, plus clear video footage from 12 different angles. She spread out printed screenshots from neighbors' phones, each showing the incident from a different perspective. Mrs. Chen's footage was particularly clear. She'd somehow managed to capture everything despite her hands shaking with anger. Amy was at school today, surrounded by supportive teachers and friends. She'd insisted on going back, showing a strength that made her mother both proud and sad. The school counselor had arranged daily check-ins, understanding that healing takes time. Her classmates had created a space wall of encouragement, filling it with drawings of planets and stars, their way of helping Amy reclaim her love for science. The police department's internal affairs office had uncovered a troubling pattern. Officer Barrett had 6 previous complaints filed against him, all mysteriously buried in the system. The second attorney, a gentle-voiced man with gray temples, explained how this discovery strengthened their case. "This wasn't an isolated incident," he said, touching a folder marked previous cases. "The department knew. They just chose to look away." Outside the office window, a small group of supporters still gathered daily, holding signs and sharing stories. Some were parents from the school. Others were community members who'd never met Mrs. Anderson but felt called to stand up for justice. They'd started a website tracking the case's progress, updating it daily with new developments and ways to help. Mrs. Anderson's phone buzzed. Another message from the parents' support group. They'd organized a rotation to help with meals, childcare, and emotional support. Today's message was about tomorrow's school board meeting, where they planned to demand better safety protocols and training. The community wasn't just fighting her case. They were working to prevent future incidents. The attorneys moved on to discussing the civil suit. Numbers were mentioned, large ones, but Mrs. Anderson's mind wandered to her classroom. Her students had written her letters, their wobbly handwriting expressing confusion and love. Why would anyone hurt the nicest teacher? One had asked. These innocent questions drove her more than any potential settlement. The police chief wants to settle, the lead attorney explained, sliding over a document. But we believe taking this to court could force real change. The words hung in the air as Mrs. Anderson thought about Amy, about her students, about every child who needed to trust in justice. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. It was another former victim of Officer Barrett coming forward after seeing the video. The middle-aged man twisted his hat in his hands as he shared his story, adding another piece to the pattern of abuse. Each new testimony strengthened their case, but also highlighted how long this problem had been ignored. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they wrapped up the meeting. Mrs. Anderson gathered her papers, including the drawings Amy's class had made for the courthouse walls. They'd insisted their teacher needed happy art to look at during the hard days ahead. One picture showed a stick figure with a cape, labeled "My Mom, the Hero." Walking to her car, Mrs. Anderson passed the courthouse where next week's hearing would be held. Construction workers were setting up security barriers, preparing for the crowds expected to attend. Local businesses had donated water and snacks for supporters. Even the coffee shop across the street had changed its specials board to read Justice Brew. Proceeds support reform. As she drove home, her phone buzzed again. The police union had issued a statement supporting the department's decision to suspend Officer Barrett pending investigation. It was a small victory, but an important one. Change was coming, not in giant leaps, but in steady steps forward. The weight of responsibility felt heavy some days, but the support made it bearable. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a movement for change, powered by ordinary people who decided enough was enough. 6 months had passed since that morning, and the police department looked different now. Not just on the surface, the changes ran deeper, like roots growing beneath the soil. The old police chief's office stood empty, his resignation letter still fresh on the new commissioner's desk. Through the windows, you could see construction workers installing new security cameras, part of the transparency initiative that Mrs. Anderson's case had sparked. In the main training room, a diverse group of officers sat watching body camera footage from various incidents, including that fateful morning. The new training instructor, a former civil rights attorney, paused the video frequently to discuss what went wrong and how it could have been handled better. Veterans and rookies alike took notes, their faces serious with understanding. The Community Oversight Board met every Tuesday evening now. Tonight, Mrs. Anderson sat among them, her voice steady as they reviewed new policies. She'd been elected as a civilian member, bringing a teacher's perspective to law enforcement reform. The board included people from all walks of life: shop owners, teachers, parents, retirees, each bringing their own experience to the table. De-escalation first read the new poster on the department walls. Below it hung a chart showing the dramatic drop in civilian complaints since the new policies took effect. The numbers told a story of change, but the real story lived in the small moments. Officers stopping to chat with kids at the park, community coffee meetings, joint training sessions with social workers. At the local elementary school, things had changed too. Amy's class had just finished their new Know Your Rights lesson, part of a curriculum that Mrs. Anderson helped develop. The children practiced what to do in different situations, role-playing with friendly officers who volunteered their time. It was about building bridges, one small interaction at a time. The department's new mental health unit had its own wing now. Social workers and counselors shared office space with officers, creating response teams that could handle crisis calls more effectively. The pilot program had already shown promising results, with fewer confrontations and better outcomes for everyone involved. In the break room, Older officers grumbled sometimes about all these changes, but even they couldn't argue with the results. Civilian complaints were down, community trust was up, and officers reported feeling safer and more supported in their work. The new policies didn't just protect civilians, they protected good officers too. Mrs. Anderson's phone buzzed with a message from the parent support group. They'd evolved into a formal community organization, meeting monthly to discuss local issues and maintain the momentum for change. Tonight's agenda included plans for a community garden outside the police station, a symbol of growth and cooperation. Outside, the memorial garden was taking shape. Volunteers worked together, planting flowers and installing benches where officers and community members could sit and talk. Amy had suggested adding a small fountain, saying the sound of water helped people stay calm. Her insight, born from trauma, was helping create spaces of healing. The new commissioner stood at her window, watching the scene below. Citizens and officers working side by side in the garden, kids riding bikes past the station without fear, elderly residents stopping to chat with patrol officers. This was what real community policing looked like, not just a slogan, but a living reality. Training manuals had been rewritten, emphasizing communication and cultural understanding. The old us versus them mentality was being replaced by we're all in this together. Monthly community forums gave everyone a voice, from the youngest student to the oldest resident. As sunset approached, Mrs. Anderson left the oversight board meeting, passing the wall of community photos in the station lobby. Among them was a picture from last month's block party. Officers and residents sharing meals, kids getting badge stickers, neighbors becoming friends. Change wasn't just happening in policy documents, it was happening in hearts and minds. Walking to her car, she noticed a young officer helping a lost child find their parent. The officer knelt to the child's level, spoke softly, offered comfort. It was a small moment, but it represented everything they've been working toward. A future where authority came with understanding, where power meant responsibility, where community meant everyone. 1 year later, Mrs. Anderson stood at the podium in the community center, looking out at a sea of familiar faces. The room buzzed with excitement. Today marked not just the end of a long legal battle, but the beginning of something new. Amy sat in the front row, no longer the frightened child from that morning, but a confident young person who'd learned early about the power of standing up for what's right. The settlement isn't just about money, Mrs. Anderson began, her voice clear and strong. It's about accountability. Behind her, a large screen displayed the new police department policies, each one crafted with input from community members. Officer Barrett had been terminated months ago, facing his own legal consequences. But that was just the start of the changes. The community center walls were covered with children's artwork, bright, hopeful pictures of police officers and citizens working together. Amy's new science project, Building Better Communities Through Understanding, had won first place in the state fair. She'd interviewed dozens of people, including reformed officers and community leaders, showing how positive change could grow from difficult moments. Mrs. Chen, still in her role as neighborhood watchdog, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She'd become a regular speaker at police training sessions, sharing her perspective as a community elder. The retired teacher, who'd recorded everything that morning, now ran a citizen journalism workshop, teaching others how to safely document and report incidents. The settlement money had been partially used to create a community foundation. Today, they were announcing the first round of grants, funding for youth programs, police training initiatives, and community outreach projects. Mrs. Anderson insisted that any real change had to include opportunities for everyone to grow and learn together. In the audience, some of Mrs. Anderson's former students sat with their parents. They were older now, but they remembered. One girl had decided to become a civil rights lawyer, inspired by watching her teacher's courage. Another had joined the Youth Police Advisory Board, building bridges between young people and law enforcement. Amy stood up to share her part of the story. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she described how her mother's strength had taught her about courage. "I used to be scared," she admitted, "but now I know that when good people stand together, things can change." Her words brought fresh tears to many eyes in the room. The police commissioner, who'd replaced the old chief, stepped up next. She spoke about the department's transformation, not just in policies, but in culture. The new training programs, community oversight boards, and partnership initiatives had become models for other cities. Mrs. Anderson's case hadn't just changed one department. It was creating ripples across the country. As the ceremony continued, Mrs. Anderson thought about that morning 1 year ago. The spilled coffee, the crushed science poster, the fear in her daughter's eyes, but also the neighbors who stood up, recorded, and refused to stay silent. The community hadn't just supported her, they'd become family. The local news teams were there, capturing the moment for their evening broadcasts. But this wasn't just another story for them anymore. Many of the reporters had become part of the journey, watching and documenting as a community transformed itself. One photographer wiped away tears as she took pictures, remembering how she'd captured those first terrible moments 1 year ago. As the event wound down, people lingered, sharing stories and hopes for the future. Children played tag between the rows of chairs, their laughter mixing with adult conversations. Officers in uniform chatted easily with residents, the barriers of mistrust slowly dissolving. This was what healing looked like, not perfect, but moving forward together. Mrs. Anderson gathered Amy in a tight hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's shampoo. They'd been through so much, but they'd come out stronger. As they walked to their car, neighbors waved, called out greetings, reached out to touch hands or shoulders, small gestures that meant everything. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope as they drove home, past the police station with its new community garden, past the school where Mrs. Anderson still taught, past the spot where everything had changed. But now those places held different memories. Memories of how a community came together, stood up, and proved that positive change was possible when people refused to look away.